Genocide means different things to different people. And growing up in Canada, I can say that my own contact with the history of the Canadian genocide very much formed the template for my engagement with the history of the British Empire all over the world, in Asia and so on. It formed the template for my looking at the history of the British Empire as genocidal. And the status of Canada as a country built on genocide was something that came up again and again during my years in Asia. And although my interest in First Nations as a young man was a small percentage of what I did with my time, a very small percentage, still the importance and significance of that genocide in forming the institutional context that I was living in Canada was of very deep significance to me. I can remember being in Laos and again having to explain to people, no, you know, white people are not the indigenous population of Australia. White people are not the indigenous population of Canada. I was explaining that in Lao. I could speak Lao well enough at that point. Came up in English a few times also. And, you know, although that was sad, I did think that it was my place and my responsibility as a member of the population who benefited from that genocide to speak the truth about it all over the world whenever it came up. And especially given the context of a country like Cambodia, which is, you know, always in the penalty box and being reproached. Oh, very, very bad Cambodia, genocide. Well, you know, yeah, Cambodia has its history of genocide. And Canada has its own history of genocide also, that nobody has put us on trial for, yet. So, in contrast to the tremendous depth of dishonesty and irresponsibility about genocide and indigenous languages in my own country, I brought that framework and that set of motivations to work on indigenous languages, minority languages, endangered languages, and dead languages when I was working in Southeast Asia. And I can very much say that it was my earlier interest in First Nations that shaped the way I approached political problems in countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia. So in a lot of ways, in terms of the chicken and the egg, I really feel that my own concern with First Nations, the indigenous people of Canada, was prior to my interest in Buddhism, my interest in Southeast Asia and its languages. However, the time in my life in which I made the decision to study Cree or to work on Algonquian languages, which is Cree and Ojibwe are the two big languages, Cree and Anishinaabe. That period of my life came at the end of many years in Asia and many years of working on Buddhism. But during those years, I have to say honestly, that issue and those motivations never disappeared. You can read that when I was invited to give a lecture at Oxford University, England, at their Centre of Buddhist Studies, I was invited directly by Professor Richard Gombrich himself. I wrote that lecture in a very short span of time. I had 2 days to put a lecture together. And I still stand by the lecture. It's an enjoyable read, but it was very rapidly written. And you can see that even there, standing at Oxford University, England, I was insisting on pointing out to them the relevance of England's own history of colonialism, the genocide, the disappearance of native languages. In Canada, I mentioned the Cree and the Ojibwe. In parallel to what we're looking at with the history and current politics of Southeast Asia. And indeed, I mean, one of the surreal things that Canada has in common with Laos is that Canada was the border where the French Empire and the British Empire met. So you have the border between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And, you know, the border between Laos and Myanmar in Southeast Asia, likewise. That was where the French Empire came in one direction and the British Empire came in the other. And they do have a direct border. And then the so-called buffer zone was Thailand at the south. So with all that having been said, I was actually elated at the chance to work on Cree when the opportunity was presented for me. And the opportunity was entirely created by my wife, who is now my ex-wife. And, you know, for that reason also, to foreshadow how the story ends, I felt that I couldn't complain too much when the opportunity was taken away from me, because I was grateful to really the one person who made it possible. I was in a situation where I already knew what a dead-end Cambodia would be for me, and I then left Cambodia, relocated to Canada, looking to spend the next 10 years of my life working on Cree and Algonquian languages, and aspiring to spend the whole rest of my life dealing with the politics of education, language endangerment, and the various struggles that Cree and Ojibwe people have, which include, of course, the struggles to simply own land, struggles over the simplest things, struggles to have drinking water and sewage, you know, tremendous need for any independent intellectual to get involved. And learning the language is a huge commitment of time and effort, but, you know, that does indeed open the door to people, you know, inviting you in and getting involved. I would also say, in contrast, you know, whenever I was in Southeast Asia talking to other researchers, I would warn them, I would share a warning that I had for myself. I would warn them, never forget, nobody here invited you to study them. Even in charity work, you said, don't forget, these people didn't invite you to come here and help them. Even when you're talking about something as obvious as starvation and of a charity coming to hand out food, there's still a sense of, hey, wait, you're a foreigner. And even if we're poor, this is our poverty. And it may be our pride and it may be our shame, but this is ours and not yours, and you weren't invited to get involved. That's a, you know, that's a politically dynamic situation that I'm very familiar with and very sensitive to. And of course I did appreciate it whenever people did invite me to do anything, you know, whether it was when somebody trusted me enough to talk about sensitive political history or sensitive religious history, or brought me into religious institutions or what have you. But I knew that my position as a researcher there, and my position doing humanitarian work, was of being an unwanted outsider. Not just an outsider, but an unwanted outsider. And what I was doing with my life when I was in Laos, Cambodia, etc., what I was seeking was a combination of research and humanitarian work, because I was a penniless intellectual and I wanted to make a positive difference in the world with my brain. There are very few places you can do that. There are very few ways you can do that. Anyone will tell you, oh, you want to do charity work? Hope you're born rich. Go ahead, start your own charity. Start asking for donations. If you're not a donor, you generally can't play the game. And most things in life require credentials and resources that, of course, I didn't have. But, you know, what I was hoping for in Asia was that I could do the hard work and it would open the doors for me to make a positive difference in the world, even if it was a small positive difference, in countries that, of course, desperately needed the help, like Laos and Cambodia. This is why, among other things, I was not looking to become a scholar of Buddhism living in a suburb of London or Paris, although many people assumed that was my aspiration. It never was. So the contrast was, you know, when I got to Canada and when I took off my gloves, rolled up my sleeves, and started working so hard on this language, started working so hard to have a new future, engaged in this set of politics, this history, these languages, is that I was surrounded by people who were saying, yes, 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 we need independent intellectuals. We need people who are hardworking and honest and intelligent. We need people who are not corrupt. We need people who are not working for the government. We need people who are not Christian missionaries to come and get involved with our struggle. Tremendously positive. The Cree and Ojibwe people I spoke to. And of course I spoke to a small number of white people who were involved in those politics and those struggles, and of course they also were very positive. And they were also staggered that I was doing the hard work of learning the language, because of course none of them had. And I spoke to, I mean, the more heartbreaking side was, of course, I met Cree people who hadn't learned the language, but who wanted to, and who spoke to me about it that way, and who gave voice to their own sense of regret about their parents and their grandparents, and how the language was disappearing in their own family, and so on. But that was, although all the circumstances are sort of tragic on a large scale and on a personal scale, that was a tremendously optimistic time for me in my life. Although I was at a university that I knew was bad from day one. It was a university that had scandals in the newspaper, including financial corruption scandals, political scandals. There's a lot of talk, and the government had actually threatened to shut down the university. I knew I was stepping into a kind of institutional disaster at that particular university, but it was a tremendously positive time for me, and I was really flourishing intellectually as well as physically. I actually had a gym. I was bench pressing and lifting weights for a change, and you know, because when you live in countries like Cambodia, I never had access to a gym, and I had access to a library, and I was gorging myself. I was throwing myself into the books with the tremendously repetitious hard work of learning the language on one side, and then the history and politics on the other side. And of course, this is a period when there's a newly emerging literature of dissent and critique, and of everyone openly asking the question, what is the future for these languages and these people, and what is the meaning of the history? So in many ways, my time working on Cree, when I was imagining a long-term future that would either be bound to some dialect of Cree or maybe to Ojibwe, a future that was wrapped up in Algonquin languages. In many ways, that was one of the happiest times in my life. And even people who know me personally tend to forget that, tend to delete that, because of how that period of my life ended. And I will put up a second video, which is called How I Stopped Learning Cree.